So good morning to you all. We're starting our seminar. Thank you for coming. We're having Professor Gabriele Durrant. She's a professor of social statistics and survey methodology in the Department of Social Statistics and Demography at the University of Southampton in the UK. She's deputy director of the ESRC, National Center for Research Methods, directed at NCRM Training, and the lead research of this NCRM work package. She is also co-investigator of the Administrative Data Research Center for England, including lead investigator of the ADRCE training program. She's currently principal investigator of a 4-year ESRC research project on Paradata. Previously, she was the director of the course in Applied Social Surveys until 2014. So we have now Gabriele, so I will give the floor to her. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me. I apologize for not being there in person, but this was due to some circumstances. I've got 3 children and so on. In fact, I was supposed to talk obviously from 10 to 11 because normally in UK time from 4 to 5 I need to collect my children from school. As it turns out, today is a lot of snow and all the schools are closed. So I could have given my presentation from 10 to 11 as it was scheduled, but Ricardo and others thought it might be better to just now stick to this timetable. So that's okay. I will talk very slowly since I don't know how well you can hear me. Okay, good, excellent. So basically, I would like to present something about or one particular example from my work. Maybe just briefly to my person. I work at the University of Southampton and have worked for probably a couple of decades on issues around non-response, and I have worked over the last 5 to 10 years around the use of paradata to improve survey design and processes, primarily with reducing non-response and non-response bias. So this is a sort of frame that I would like to touch base on. I looked at your program, and I believe Barry and others have probably given slightly more general presentations. So I'm happy to give you a general idea about my research or about the work that we are doing here in Southampton more generally, and then sort of give you an example of something that one could do with Paradata and improving surveys to use it in responsive and adaptive survey designs. I primarily, first of all, looked at face-to-face data, and I've got some research published in this area to sort of improve surveys. But of course, some of these methods can be used for telephone data in principle. I've looked at quite a lot of information on call record data. So when the interviewer goes to a household and asks for a response from the household, the type of data that is then collected, I would refer that here as call record data. Sometimes it's referred to call history data or something like that. So again, this research looks primarily at non-response issues. I've worked quite a bit with statistical offices, for example, with the Office for National Statistics, and I've got some collaborations with let's say Statistics Sweden, Statistics Norway, and Statistics Netherlands as an example. I'm also nowadays working quite a bit on online surveys, in particular the use of so-called paradata around online surveys. For example, using information how people respond, what type of device they use, what type of mobile device they may use, either for surveys that are specifically designed for mobile device, or, which is still sometimes the case in the UK by the Office for National Statistics, that some surveys are not specifically designed for, or online surveys are not specifically designed for mobile devices. So we are interested in who are the people that respond in particular ways, and can one use this type of paradata to maybe do some adjustments or to improve survey processes. And I'm working on a couple of online surveys, panel online surveys, for example, with NatCen, the National Center for Research Methods, the National Center for Economic Research, Social Research in the UK, in London, and with GESIS, another infrastructure institute in Germany. I've also done some work, and this is all in the area of using paradata. I've used information on interviewers and looking at interviewer effects. So one can use different types of modeling to analyze interviewer effects in, for example, face-to-face surveys. We've used a whole range of multi-level models, and I've got some more recent work that hopefully will be coming out in a journal at some point in the not too distant future, using a location scale model, a particular multi-level model, to investigate the variance that is sort of caused by interviewers and how much the interviewer may have an influence on survey outcomes. Now, having given sort of a broader idea about some of the work that we have been doing, I was thinking to give you an example of how to use so-called paradata or core record data to investigate data quality issues effectively. Here we looked at a whole range of indicators, but I was thinking probably best to keep it relatively simple and to try and give you one particular example about a couple of indicators that we have used. So I start with the actual core of the presentation. If you have any questions up to now, I guess we should leave questions to the end, I suspect. Yeah?
Yes, that would be fine, yes.
Okay, so one question is obviously in face-to-face surveys that certainly here in the UK, some statistical offices are running surveys for quite a long time. They're making a lot of calls, and by calls I now mean visits of interviewers to households. So sometimes they make 20, 30 visits to a household before they get a response or before they get the full response from a full household. Here I'm looking primarily at household effects. So that means if 2 or 3 or 4 people are living in a household, then ideally more than one person should respond. So there may be several people in a household that should be responding. It depends a little bit on the type of survey, of course, and the survey design. So the question is, particularly from a sort of cost and efficiency perspective, how many calls should we make to a household? And as I said, calls, I'm meaning here visits. I'm talking primarily about interviewer visits on a household. So I'm talking about face-to-face surveys here in this particular research. Although similar type of data could be used for other types of surveys, for example, looking at telephone surveys clearly, but also in different contexts, and I'll come to that more towards the end of the presentation. The key question is when to stop calling at a household. So how many calls, not exactly the specific number, but roughly how many visits should we make to a household to get a satisfactory response? Because we don't want to make actually too many visits, because that is costing a lot of money. On the other hand, you obviously want to make sufficient number of visits to ensure data quality. And here we are looking at data set representativeness during data collection. So really looking at non-response issues primarily. And here, a linked census data study, we are using for this assessment quite a unique data set, and I'll go to that in a little bit more detail in one of my next slides.
Excuse me, we are not seeing yours. We're seeing just the first slide. Are you moving your slides?
No, yes, okay, I can now move on.
Okay.
Yes, I only showed my
Okay. Just to make sure. Okay, thank you.
I won't remain on the first slide.
Okay.
So I just wanted to give you the sort of frame.
Okay.
So basically, just to sort of motivate this particular work, clearly we are aware that response rates in many government surveys and also in many countries are falling. There is certainly great concern. Certainly that's the case here in Great Britain, in the UK. Certainly over recent years in particular, response rates have fallen even further. And there are clearly great concerns around that, and therefore the UK is really exploring using administrative data to replace some of the survey data. And there's a lot of pressure to put surveys online, for example. So clearly there are a lot of things at the moment going on, certainly from the UK perspective, but I suspect in many other countries similar moves are carrying the same. So there are clearly concerns about the resulting data quality. And the focus, I mean, on my slide, the slides are moving backwards and forwards a little bit. Is that the case with you?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not doing anything, just to let you know. I'm not sure why this is happening. So, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So obviously, also the shift has focused. The focus has shifted from non-response rate to obviously also look at non-response bias. And generally sort of indicators of representativeness. I'm trying to think. I mean, there's nothing that I do that makes these slides move. So, yeah.
Help from here. Just tell me, and we can go.
Okay. No, don't worry. I can move them backwards and forwards, as in slide 2, 3, 4. But they are sometimes appearing a little bit smaller and then larger again. Okay. It doesn't disturb me, but just wanted to mention. So obviously for the assessment of non-response bias, we ideally would like to have fully observed information about also the non-respondents, but normally that's of course very difficult in the presence of non-response. So we would like to measure at least the risk of non-response bias. So even if you can't necessarily assess the actual non-response bias, we should be getting some indicators of risks of non-response. So the next slide. Obviously, at the same time, we are increasing survey data collection costs are increasing. There is certainly in the UK a big pressure on saving money and more efficiency-driven considerations. And at the same time, we want to maintain the actual data quality to achieve ideally similar response rates. For example, for more and more calls or visits or follow-ups to sample members are then necessary to maintain response rates. So clearly one key question is how many calls do we want to make? And at the moment in the UK for some surveys, certainly there are sometimes 20, 30 visits done for a particular household. And the question is that really necessary? Of course, not every visit to a household costs the same amount, because you may be just dropping past and then that's in theory an efficient way of dealing with that. Nevertheless, we think that these number of calls and visits can significantly be reduced. And in fact, the Office for National Statistics has now reduced the number of calls from, I believe, 2030 to 13 at the moment, and that obviously resulted in great efficiency savings, but more could potentially even be done. So coming back to these actual research questions, questions are things like how to monitor, assess and minimize the risk of non-response bias during data collection. And also questions maybe from survey practice, when to stop calling without actual loss of data quality or minimized loss of data quality, and can we achieve cost savings. So how do we go about assessing the risk of non-response bias? So I would like to give here one example. There may be a lot of different ways of doing that, and we've looked at different types of indicators. Here I've only picked just one, because this one works quite well, but of course there are many other indicators that one could look at, and we've done a whole sensitivity study with many, many different indicators. But I thought maybe for this particular setup and this particular presentation, it would be good to keep it relatively straightforward, since I wasn't quite sure how well the connection would work and so on. So the main idea is to measure similarity between sample data obtained and frame data in terms of the actual variation in response rates. Now, obviously, this here is possible because of our particular data set, but similar things could be achieved even using different types of data. And certainly, offices for national statistics should be able to address some of that. So we are using, of course, a response propensity model to obtain estimated response propensities, and these are the sort of the basic tools to work with and to derive indicators. So when one can derive representativeness indicators, they estimate basically the variation in these response propensities, where SD is denoting the standard deviation of these response propensities. So we are interested in how variable these response propensities are. And low variability in response propensities would then imply high representativeness. So we are looking for low variability in response rates. And high variability would indicate low representativeness potential. Okay, just looking at the very basic form of this sort of representativeness indicator, we've looked at a whole range of indicators, as I said, for example, the R indicator that is quite well known, but we also found some potential downsides with the R indicator in this context of core record data. So here I would like to look at an indicator that's very similar, the coefficient of variation, which is basically looking at the variation of response propensities, but then in relation to the actual response rate. So a CV, a coefficient of variation that is close to zero, indicates then a high representativeness. So we're looking for ideally low CV values. Here we can compute them at each call, and so basically at each visit to a household. In theory, you can do this in real time if you have systems set up. So obviously, if you are able to use responsive data design where you're collecting data, paradata in real time and can feed this back into a central system, that will then obviously allow to calculate those types of indicators at every stage and to allocate interviewers accordingly. So just to look at the actual data that we had here for our study, it's the Census Non-Response Link Study. The ONS, the Office for National Statistics, collected all of this data, and they put this data together and linked it. They've done several of those versions in previous years as well. So every time they carried out a census, which is carried out every 10 years in the UK, they were able to carry out such a non-response link study. So this is data from the most recent one, and potentially another one will come out after the next census, which maybe at that time will be at least partially online or mostly online. So maybe different types of data will be available. That will obviously be very interesting to look at and to analyze. So here we are linking the response indicator from potentially several surveys. I think 6-7 surveys were originally included. Here we're looking just at the labor force survey, and we are linking this data, this outcome, indicating if a household responded or not, to the actual survey core record data, as well as individual and household level census data. So we've got a lot of information available for each household. We know if they responded or not, and we've got the actual core record data, the core history data. Some work investigated just the indications of household level census variables. Here we are expanding this work on individual level census data, so there is a number of information out there. Or this reference should actually say 2018 rather than 2017. And we can monitor survey responses, obviously during data collection, and compare these estimates that we can derive on representativeness based on these census estimates. And here we are making up to 20 calls to a household, up to 20 visits to a household. We can, in theory, at every stage, compare how well we are doing with where we should be going ahead, or what we may be measuring at the very end. And obviously, with that we have with the switch data after it has been collected, we can try out a lot of sensitivity analysis and try out a lot of methods and compare that to the sort of ideal standard that we have, but see how things may work in the field if we didn't have this ideal data, or if we didn't have all the call record data or the end result. So what would you do during data collection? How well would that work? Obviously, there are still questions about generalizability, but nevertheless, this gives you quite a good idea about how to progress and how to evaluate such data. Let's have a look at some of the results. So these are now plots looking at, first of all, the overall CVs, overall coefficients of variation. Overall just simply means they're not specific to a particular variable or particular category of a variable. They're really sort of indicating overall representativeness. And here in these plots, can you see if I'm moving my mouse? Okay. So in which case, me moving the mouse here and pointing at things doesn't mean anything to you, right?
No.
Oh, okay. I'll try and explain it without being able to point at things. Obviously, we can see here at the top graph the number of calls, the call number on the x-axis. So here ranging between 0 and 20 to 20 visits, or 1 to 20. And the blue line going upwards is indicating simply the response rate. Obviously, the response rate improves as we go along and make more visits to a household. And we can see that already after about 7, 8, 9 calls, this response rate doesn't actually improve very much anymore. As you would expect, you probably get the vast majority of households within the first 3, 4, 5 calls. And after that, the increase in response rate is rather minimal. And there's obviously a question, what type of households would you like to follow up? Is it really worth carrying out so many visits to all these different types of households? And the red line indicates the decline in the coefficient of variation, remembering that a small CV is indicating good representativeness. So we are looking ideally at numbers that are very small, going towards 0. And again, we can see, looking at this curve going downwards, that obviously at core 1 and 2, representativeness is quite bad to start with, but it very quickly, core 5, 7, 8 or so, CVs have reached a certain level and they're not really improving after that anymore. So there could be an argument that maybe after the 8th, 9th call, you're quite safe if you look at this sort of overall indications. Now, obviously, you can drill that down, looking at particular variables and influences on particular variables, since not all variables will behave in the same way. Some variables may still remain biased. They may not go down to 0. And some may decline a lot quicker than others. So here we are just looking at these so-called partial CVs in the lower graph, and we can see again the partial CVs based on a range of variables indicating, for example, tenure or employment last week, or qualifications or age, and so on. So obviously you can choose the type of variable you're particularly interested in, and you may choose a number of variables that you always want to compare and follow up with that you have available. Obviously, these are now variables where we do have census information, so fully observed information is available. So obviously we can do that here. So this gives us an indication that with regards to a number of other variables, the CVs are also declining, but maybe with some variables this is declining faster and some still remain biased even after many calls. So again, one may be able to send interviewers into the field in a particular way to maybe help with this type of non-response bias reduction. Then one can also look at, now on the next slide, at category partial CVs. So I'm particularly interested in particular variable and their specific category. So I would like to see, for example, in terms of qualification here, if particular categories are underrepresented. Maybe the lower qualified people are maybe underrepresented for longer than higher qualified people, or something similar. So again, one can look at the tendencies of these different categories across calls. And again, we can see that after 5-6 calls, very quickly, there is not really much change in terms of representativeness and improving data quality. So whilst still some indicators may indicate non-representativeness or still indicate risk of non-response bias, we are particularly interested in the change. So even if you're making 20 calls, you're maybe not changing, you're not actually improving the data quality. You're making more calls and so on, but it doesn't actually get the non-response bias or the risk of non-response bias down necessarily, even if there is some remaining. One can look at different types of indicators, of course. For example, one can look at like the census percentage bias, so looking at the number of calls and the proportion of a particular outcome at the nth call, so at a one particular call, and you can subtract, for example, the proportion that you would have from the census, so the true value to some extent, and calculate the percentage based on that. So you can compare the outcome from the nth call to the census value. You can also compare the outcome from the nth proportion to, let's say, proportion at the very end. So if you didn't have census information, you could compare it to the end estimate that you would receive had you done already 20 calls. Now, again, you can only evaluate that once you've done the entire survey data collection process, but nevertheless, for using these indicators, I think that's quite helpful. And of course, one can look at different types of categories as well. And I'll come to that in a second, but what we may be able to do if we don't have census variables and how this may be compare. We can actually see that even if you don't have the true census variables, you can still compare, for example, the decrease and the change and so on, and you may still conclude that with 20 calls you're not doing any better than after 7 or 8 calls. Now this is another variable, the variable age, also looking at category partial CVs and comparing that with census values. Again, very similar patterns. Some categories here, for example, for 35 to 54 remain possibly somewhat biased, or the bias is going to be different from other categories. This is just one example. So the key thing is one can look at these graphs and follow the trends and see how quickly this sort of converges, or what the trend is. So now obviously the question is, when should we stop calling, or what are phase capacity points? So stop calling would mean we stop the actual data collection and we are happy with the type of data that we have received up to a certain point. Or phase capacity points would imply we go up to a certain number of calls, and then we assess that with our current strategy of data collection, we don't really improve data collection and data quality anymore. That means we would enter a new phase of data collection, and we would change something about the data collection design. For example, we may want to send better or different interviewers, or we may want to follow up with reminders or telephone calls and so on. So you may do something to intervene, or you may offer an incentive or something like that. So the question is when to change a survey data collection method. Next slide. Obviously there are different ways of defining such phase capacity points. For example, we could define it as a small value, you're being within a small value, let's say 0.02 of the previous value during data collection. So we are comparing every estimate or every result obtained to the previous estimate and see if there is any change. We can also compare it to the final value after data collection. Obviously, we can only do that not in real time, but only after the survey has been completed, or we use some kind of estimate, or possibly the overall phase capacity point within 0.02 of this minima was then around 6 calls. So we found that overall, looking at these cutoff points, effectively was about 6 calls. So even if you're just looking at these graphs, it's intuitively sort of indicated, but you can obviously do this with actual measurements as well. Looking at these phase capacity points based on, let's say, particular variables, qualification in this case, defined as within a small value of the previous value, or within the small value of the final value. And we can see that they're around the sort of 4 and 5 number of call marks. So different types of categories, different types of percentage differences that you can calculate sort of indicate that. Now obviously none of these things come necessarily up with exactly the same number, but it's probably more the sort of upper number that we're looking at. It's sort of indicating we don't need to make 7, 8, let alone 20 calls to come up with the same data quality. Or here, phase capacity points was on a different variable, for example, age. Again, we are seeing overall that probably drilling down between 4 and 5 calls is probably sufficient to obtain more or less the same data quality. So again, the conclusion is, to be on the safe side, you could at least do 6, 7 calls, but 20 is not necessarily necessary. Obviously, there's a question about survey variables where we don't have information from the census. So previously, we've looked at census variables that are also in the surveys, because obviously some variables overlap in terms of the actual contents. But clearly in the survey you would collect many more variables and you may not have an equivalent census variable. But still, you can see how these variables perform, these representativeness indicators based on these variables perform across calls, and you can see again that they do obviously converge. And they converge around the sort of, per definition, around the 0 mark. But nevertheless, yes, you don't necessarily know if that indicates a high or low non-response bias, but you can at least see if there is some kind of convergence and if some sort of phase capacity has been reached. Looking at PC points based on these surveys without census variables, again, sort of 7 calls were basically the maximum we found here, depending on what type of variable and category we used. Yeah, just to sort of summarize implications for survey practice. So to achieve the same non-response bias indicator results, almost the same response rate, basically, it seems to be sufficient to make about 5 or 6 calls to a sample unit, and certainly not 20. So we discussed that in great detail with the Office for National Statistics, and as said at the beginning, they've now changed some of their data collection procedures from 20 to 13. So they want to be obviously on the safe side. They don't want to make very radical changes, but they have changed it to 13, and already this includes many call savings. We've been trying to get an indication from them how many savings, how this relates into savings, and get a sort of a number on that. But it's certainly a large saving that is associated with that, but they couldn't really give me a proper number on that. So we've been trying very hard to get some indication, but that so far has not been so successful. So the number of calls on a sample unit can therefore be potentially significantly reduced. There are implications for cost savings without necessarily the loss of data quality. I've included here some references. One is submitted and one has been published already in the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society, and this is work jointly with Jamie Moore and also Peter Smith, also both from the University of Southampton. We also obviously have expanded this type of work very significantly, looking, for example, at correlates of record linkage and estimating risks of non-linkage bias. So obviously, linkage is very similar problem conceptually to the non-response problem, because at every linkage stage, you're losing people. You may not be able to link people, or maybe people didn't give consent to be linked, and so on. So you have different stages at survey data collection points where maybe you want to link information. Additionally, also in the UK, there's a big concern about using administrative data. You may want to use and link administrative data to survey data, or different types of administrative data to each other. And again, one can use the same sort of ideas, using these sort of representativeness indicators for estimating risks of non-linkage bias, of course. So we've done some work in this area. We are still working on expanding that, and obviously looking at the non-linkage bias problem as a sort of non-response problem. In fact, we are now at the moment in the process of submitting another grant proposal in this area, using different types of non-response aspects for estimating non-linkage. So again, an area where one can use effectively power data or so background administrative data to be able to make assessments about the data quality of survey and or administrative data. There's briefly some acknowledgement to the ONS and also to the work that has been funding this type of research, primarily the National Centre for Research Methods, but also the Administrative Research Centre for England funded my time on this research. So thank you very much. I hope it was possible to follow this. And if you have any questions, please let me know. You can also send me possibly easier rather than...
Oh, thank you very much. Well, yes, Gabriel, I would like to pick some questions from the audience, and if you please write it down. Si pudieran escribir mejor preguntas si tienen, creo que sea más fácil, si no vamos con el micrófono. I would like to just remark 3 ideas that are important and very useful for national statistical offices, which are these indicators to monitor risk of non-response bias. And yeah, the phase capacity, which is a very interesting idea, the rules for stopping. And I think that can lead us to evaluate or maybe change a data collection strategy, which is another very interesting idea. So now I will open the floor. So if someone has a question, please. Par de preguntas, 2 questions, yes.
Yeah, my question is, your conclusion is the number for the visit is 5 or 6. Have you tried to use some model to compare with these findings? Because there is a paper of Cochrane and Dimin in 1980, and they use a multinomial model to model in the expected number of visits. This is my question.
Did you catch the question, Gabriel?
I understood something about if I considered a particular model and that there's a paper from the 1980s by, and then I didn't catch the name.
The author are Cochrane and Dimin. They use a multinomial model to find the expected number of visits.
Yes.
The categorical where we looked at outcome of a particular call. So this is also using call record data, but the aim of this work was to predict particular call outcomes. Yeah, I'm not quite sure if this answers your question, but I just heard something about modeling the number of calls.
Yes.
Yes, and we have done that as well, and obviously, yes, you can do that. Actually, try and model, estimate the number of calls that are needed.
Thanks.
Yes, I think you answered the question.
The reference that you mentioned, that would be interesting.
And you repeat the last sentence, please?
Me?
Yes, I can read. Yes, we can hear you, but I would like to review the last sentence to make sure.
Oh, okay. I said that I've done some work on modeling the number of calls and trying to predict a particular outcome of a call. So when an interviewer makes a visit to a household, if we have a little bit of information about the household, can we predict what the outcome of the next call is going to be? Because obviously we are interested in a positive outcome. So we have done quite a bit of work in this area, trying to come up with good models that really predict call outcomes, and not just allowing for response, non-response, but different types of outcomes. So using multinomial models that can predict, for example, postponement, appointments, and so on, and that take into account as much information as we have about a household. For example, first of all, taking into account the area that they live in or any information that we have about the household. But of course, as time goes on and we are making more calls to a household, even if they don't respond, we are collecting more and more information. For example, interview observation information, and all of this information from every call we can take into account to predict the number of calls that are necessary for a household to respond positively. So this is related work, but it doesn't take into account questions about the actual data quality or effects of non-response bias. So my answer would be, yes, we have done some modeling about the number of calls that are required, but this was sort of separate work, and I would be interested in getting the reference that the person in the audience mentioned from the 1980s, I believe.
I will email you the reference. Well, the author are Cochrane and Dimi.
Oh, thank you. We have another question here.
Thank you. My question is about the coefficient of response. And my question is that if that coefficient takes into account some information that we may have about the population. The information that I am thinking is about that in some cases we know that some strata have different variants, and also that in some strata the potential bias is greater than other strata. For instance, in the surveys of health, we approach people and we ask, have you been diagnosed with diabetes? And some people say yes, and others say no. And this is our first stage. And then, and the second stage, we try to get a sample of blood. And in this case, the potential bias is different. It's different for the case in the people that we know that he was diagnosed as the diabetes. The potential bias is different in such cases compared to the cases that they said, I have not been diagnosed with diabetes. Thanks.
Yes.
I cannot hear, I can hear that the person is talking, but I cannot understand the question. I didn't understand the question at all this time. Maybe you could just very briefly repeat.
Martin, could you just phrase the question very clear so she can get the question, then you can re-elaborate a little bit more?
I think it's the acoustics. The person in the audience with the microphone.
Okay. Sorry.
Yes, okay, I understand. Yes, hold a second, he's coming now, and I think he can phrase the question
It's a
very well.
short question. Okay, sorry. Okay, my question is that about the coefficient of representativeness.
Yes.
My question is if that coefficient takes into account some information that we may have about the population. For instance, that some strata have different variants.
Okay. Yes, I mean there are different types of coefficients of variation that you can look at. I'm just trying to think. I mean, in principle, yes, we can take into account. Yes, there are different types of coefficients of variation. Yes, I do remember. Now, what I've just shown was just a sort of basic sample-based idea. But there are, like from the R indicator, it's all originated from that. You can take into account population values as well. So yes, the work has been done by Barry Charlton and others primarily. I believe Barry might be there somewhere in the audience, I guess. So yes, there are different types of R indicators and CV variations, and some are population-based and some are sample-based. So in principle, yes, that is possible.
Thanks much.
Thank you. We have one more question there in the audience, please. Let me see if you can hear this question. Okay.
Hello, my name is Eduardo Chalat from the INEGI, the National Statistics in Mexico. The first question is just to make sure. My assumption is that are you working with the UK Office of National Statistics? Or, are you interacting directly with the office, with the staff of the Office of the National Statistics?
I personally don't. Again, I hear bits of the question, but not the full picture. I work with the Office for National Statistics, but I'm not employee by them. We generally in Southampton work quite closely with the Office for National Statistics, and we sometimes advise them, or sometimes they give us data that we can analyze and so on. And yes, they came to us when they heard about our work that we did. They were very interested, and then we discussed how to take this work forward, and as a result, they reduced their number of calls from 20 to 13 on a number of surveys. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that was the first question. But then, what is the specific feedback that you are giving to the ONS in terms of the paradata that they should collect, so that you can provide better feedback to them in terms of the adjustments that they have to make to the surveys?
Yes, so that's a good question. What type of paradata is needed to be able to do any analysis? Here we've really only used the number of call records. So, obviously the more data you've got, the better. So the number of calls should be registered. The interviewer ID ideally should be registered, that you can identify which interviewer has gone to which household. The outcome of every call should be identifiable, and that should be consistently recorded in a consistent way. Sometimes some of these values can be missing. Interviewers may not fill in their sheets and so on. So that is really important, that you somehow have a system where interviewers regularly update their system. Obviously, if you want to make analysis during the data collection stage, you really have you need to have good systems in place that record the information and feed it back to the office. You may want to start with something that you collect the data, and then only at the end of the survey data collection process you analyze it, and then you inform future surveys. So it depends on what stage you are at. What other variables are really important? I find interview observation variables are really important, but again, it is difficult sometimes to collect them in a consistent way. Again, for this particular work, I primarily need just simply the number of calls made to each household. That is maybe simpler done than actually done in practice, and the outcome of each call. So that is, for this particular work, very important. And ideally, you want to have some information about each household, for example, from a registration database or from administrative data or from the census or something like that, that you know something about the household. Again, if you don't have that information, interviewers could collect information, for example, if it's likely that children are present or if a car is present and so on. But again, this type of information may be very patchy. So yeah, for this type of information, for this type of work, you don't need very much, effectively. Ideally, you're collected at a high standard. Paradata very often is messy and has a lot of missing values. That makes work sometimes very difficult. If you want to drill down further, it is sometimes more difficult to collect data. Obviously now with systems going towards, let's say, online surveys, obviously the computer can collect potentially a lot of information, and there we are looking at potentially very large amounts of data that we are getting from, let's say, mobile device use. So it really depends on the type of survey as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Is there any other question here, please? No. So, well, we would like to thank you very much for your presentation. I think it's extremely helpful, useful. Thank you very much, Gabrielle.